These are the first images following a deadly confrontation at sea. Wounded survivors are being treated at this hospital in the Cuban city of Santa Clara. Cuba's Interior Ministry says a US-registered vessel entered its territorial waters near Corralillo, off the northern coast of central Cuba. Coast guards moved in to identify the boat. State media say shots were fired from on board, wounding a Cuban commander.
According to preliminary statements, the speedboat was carrying 10 armed individuals who intended to carry out a terroristic infiltration.
Authorities seized assault rifles, handguns, homemade explosive devices, Molotov cocktails, bulletproof vests, telescopic sights and camouflage uniforms.
All of the participants are Cuban nationals residing in the United States, most with known records of criminal and violent activity.
The incident unfolded as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio was meeting leaders of the 15-member Caribbean Community bloc known as CARICOM. The talks focused on regional stability and economic pressure. Washington announced it would ease parts of an oil embargo on Cuba. Rubio, a Cuban American and longtime critic of Havana's government, called for dramatic change, saying Cuba's leadership is responsible for the island's economic crisis. Rubio said US agencies are working to verify details of the speedboat incident.
The majority of the information we still possess is what Cuban authorities are providing both the public and the US government. We have our embassy on the ground in Havana working this as we speak, asking for access to the people that were on those vessels, if they were American citizens or permanent residents. According to the Cuban regime, that the boat was registered in Florida. It is highly unusual to see shootouts in open sea like that. It's not something that happens every day. It's something, frankly, that hasn't happened with Cuba in a very long time.
The latest development further strains already tense relations between Havana and Washington.
And let's get more. We are joined now by Lillian Guerra, is a professor of history at the University of Florida, specializing in Cuban history. Thank you so much for your time. So far, we haven't been able to verify the Cuban government's claims. What do you make of their version of events?
Well, I think that there are certain things we still don't know. They claim that those who were on the boat when they were encountered by the Coast Guard of Cuba fired first, and then the Cuban Coast Guard fired back. 4 were killed. It seems that that has been confirmed. 6 were taken in. We don't know much other than what the Cuban state has said. There are certain things that have been verified by the Miami press, and it looks like by authorities in Miami. One is that the boat was registered in Miami to a 65-year-old owner who is actually in Miami. And then it seems that the organization responsible is one called Autodefensa del Pueblo, which is relatively new. Its goal is effectively to land people in Cuba. It claims to have a kind of clandestine network of supporters already on the island who are actively subverting the regime. So, you know, some of the people whose names were released by the Cuban government have been verified as members of this organization. One in particular, whose last names are Sanchez Gonzalez. He seems to be one of the founders and president of the organization, and he is currently in Cuba under custody.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, meantime, says that no American personnel were involved in the incident, but that the U.S. will carry out its own investigation. You know, put this into the bigger picture for us. What is this likely to mean now for U.S.-Cuban ties, which are already very tense?
Yes, so it is very much the case that the United States has not backed this kind of incursion since it ended a 5-year-long program called Operation Mongoose that lasted from 1960 to 1965. The CIA in those years had the largest headquarters in the country outside of its own in Virginia, and those were at the University of Miami in Miami. And so when that ended, paramilitary organizations who felt betrayed in many cases by the U.S. government kept up these kinds of operations. But they really were very unsuccessful, and the Cuban government kept capturing people. And so they ended pretty much in the early 70s. And we didn't get another incident like this until 1996, when an organization called Hermanos al Rescate, virtually to the day, February 24th, 1996, 30 years ago, was shot down. Two of their planes were shot down by MiGs from Cuba, and the men on board died. So as a result of that, the Clinton administration did something it didn't want to do. It, through congressional means, it made the U.S. embargo permanent. So effectively, the embargo until that point against Cuba, a U.S. policy in place since 1960, 1961, it had really been an executive policy. And then after 1996, it became permanent and can only be removed through an act of Congress. Now, since then, we've only had a couple of incidents, and they haven't been of a political nature. One was a speedboat from Miami that apparently was carrying drugs, and in 2002 engaged in a violent shootout with the Coast Guard of Cuba. And then in that same year, there was another boat carrying about 10 people, I believe it was. At least 5 were killed by the Cuban Coast Guard. The survivors claimed that they had been hit purposefully. But those were not military or paramilitary operations. This one is very unlikely to have had anything to do with U.S. intelligence. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have tremendous implications. And Marco Rubio just yesterday put some light between the exile community and its demands for change there and the Trump administration's policies.
Okay, we have to leave it there, but very interesting indeed. Thank you so much for putting that into context for us. Lillian Guerra, Cuban history expert from the University of Florida. We appreciate your time.